Be careful what you wish for is a lesson we learn as children. This is apparently a lesson that has not been learned or was not learned by Lisa Cook and her little buddies in the deep state that support the Federal Reserve System. That's right, Lisa Cook has just sued Donald Trump, claiming that he cannot remove her from her position as the governor or one of the governors of the Federal Reserve System. This is going to backfire, I suspect, big time, not just on Lisa Cook, but on the Federal Reserve. And this may actually lead to the end of the Fed. Let's break it down when we come back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so there's a lot of lessons in the law that we can learn about the Second Amendment, even if we're not talking about the Second Amendment, because as I've explained to you before, American law, American constitutional law is like one big spider web. If you pull one strand of a big web, guess what happens? The entire spider web moves, even if all you're doing is grabbing one single strand. And that's a lesson I keep trying to hammer home here at the Four Boxes Diner, because even if there's lawsuits and litigations involving the Constitution outside of the specific context of our right to keep and bear arms, what happens in those cases can set precedents, good and bad or ugly, that has a ripple effect on all of our liberties and all of our rights as American citizens, including our right to keep and bear arms. And there's a very big thing going on right now, which I touched briefly on about a week or so ago, and that is whether or not this major fight between President Donald Trump as the executive officer, the boss of the executive branch under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which creates the executive branch and the president, versus the Federal Reserve, which right now has been functioning as legally, in my view, really a fourth branch of government. Just to jog your memory, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution creates the Congress, the legislative branch of the federal government. Article 2 creates the executive or the presidential branch of the federal government. Article 3 creates the courts, the Supreme Court, and the judicial branch of the federal government. Those are the three branches of government that are supposed to kind of be engaged in the separation of powers and the fights amongst each other and all this kind of stuff. And the effect, according to the founding fathers, was to protect our freedoms and our rights from an overbearing tyrannical government. Unfortunately, we have essentially a fourth branch of government, arguably, and that is in the form of the Federal Reserve System that essentially oversees the creation of money, the money supply, the destruction of our currency, and all sorts of other things, including effectively setting interest rates. We don't need to get into a detailed analysis of the economics of the situation here. Just understand that the Federal Reserve System, which was created by a terrible anti-American President Woodrow Wilson, who was awful, absolutely awful, almost as bad as FDR. There's a competition between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson for, taking America into the abyss. But I digress. The point is, Woodrow Wilson in 1913 signed into law the Federal Reserve System, which created essentially a fourth branch of government, essentially an independent group of bankers responsible for monitoring the monetary supply, the currency, the dollar, of dealing with inflation issues and all sorts of things. Again, we don't need to get into these details. Just understand that since 1913, the Federal Reserve System has been functioning largely as an independent bank as part of our federal government, but they are not really overseen by any one branch of government, even though the governors are appointed by the president and they're confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Beyond that, they kind of function independently, and many people think that's a feature and a good thing, but the reality is it's likely the case that the Federal Reserve System is probably unconstitutional because it doesn't have an adequate amount of oversight by the President of the United States under the executive branch. Because again, just step back and think about it big picture-wise. If you're dealing with Congress, if they do something dumb, the voters know who to punish. Those are the Congress people. If the president does something dumb, you can go after the president, complain to the president for screwing that up, or maybe vote him out of office. And of course, the courts are independent, but they're expressly created by Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. So even though we may have complaints about the Supreme Court and the courts, the reality is they are literally created as part of the federal government. And in theory, we could amend the Constitution under Article 5 processes to fix the federal court system. But what exactly is the Federal Reserve System, known as the Fed? Well, the the answer is it's not part of Congress. It's not part of the executive branch. It's not part of the judicial branch. It's kind of a fourth branch of government. And again, the question is it constitutional? Well, we're going to find out right here and right now if that's the case, because Federal Reserve Board of Governor member, one of the governors on the Federal Reserve System, Lisa Cook, has just been declared removed by President Donald Trump. But rather than quietly going into the night, accepting the fact that she's been fired and moving on and going to work for some major bank making $7 million a year or whatever you can do as a former Fed official, Lisa Cook, who is an African-American woman who was appointed to the Federal Reserve System as a governor by Joe Biden, she has decided to litigate the question. In fact, she brought a lawsuit just now against Donald Trump, claiming that Donald Trump, as the President of the United States, lacks the legal authority to remove her from her position as a governor on the Federal Reserve Board. Now, just as a reminder, before we get into the legal technicalities here about why this may very well blow up the Federal Reserve System, we're going to get to that in 1 second. But before we do that, I want to remind everyone what happened here. Lisa Cook, a Biden appointee to the Federal Reserve System, had a 14-year appointment, okay? That 14-year appointment, we're in the middle of that now. If you look at the relevant statute that creates the governor position, of which there's I think there's 7 of them, 7 governors, it specifically says that you're picked by the president, you're nominated by the president of the United States, you're confirmed by the U.S. Senate for a term of 14 years. Unless, listen carefully, folks, the language of the statute says, unless you are removed for cause by the president. It's a 14-year term unless you are removed for cause by the president. So what's happening here is the question is, who decides what is for cause? What does it mean to be removed for cause? Well, Lisa Cook is arguing that the allegations that she engaged in mortgage fraud, sometimes referred to as occupancy-related mortgage fraud. She argues that to the extent that that's true, all of that alleged fraud where she procured multiple mortgages on the grounds that she had primary residences, but you're only allowed to have one primary residence. Everything else other than that is not a primary residence. And what she allegedly did was she went out there and she borrowed money from federal financial institutions at lower rates on better terms, because banks, as a general matter, for various reasons, will give you a better deal at lower interest rates on better terms if you're acquiring your own primary home, because we in the United States like to encourage home ownership. But that's a far cry from someone that wants to buy a second, a third, a fourth home, either because they like it or because they want to rent it out or for some other reason. So what she allegedly is to have done, Lisa Cook allegedly, and the documents look kind of authentic to me. I think the Washington Post even indicated they may very well be authentic. What apparently happened is she represented to the financial institutions that are backed by the federal system that she was buying these various homes almost at the same time or very close in time together. And while she was acquiring these homes, she was swearing on various documents that each of these particular homes were going to serve as her primary residence. And because they're going to be her primary residence, she was able to get lower deals, better deals. The problem is, according to the allegations that have been reported on, she did this to multiple homes, claiming their multiple homes were going to be her primary residence, even though you're only allowed to have one. And yet she was claiming primary residency or primary occupancy status on multiple homes, which means that she was getting better terms and conditions and lower interest rates on multiple properties to which she was simply not entitled to. And she was able to procure that financial benefit allegedly by virtue of committing fraud, i.e. intentionally lying in writing to these federal banks that were loaning her money to buy these homes in the form of a mortgage. So this has now been uncovered, and there's a criminal referral to the Department of Justice that's just occurred. But Donald Trump looked at this as the president and claimed that under the relevant statute, he, as the president, is entitled to declare that this kind of behavior is a for-cause reason to fire her and terminate her position as a governor of the Federal Reserve System, which, of course, if she vacates that position, it allows Donald Trump to nominate someone that he would prefer over Biden appointee Lisa Cook. So Lisa Cook's position in court is this is not a for-cause basis because she hasn't apparently denied that she did this. Her lawyers kind of denied it, but I don't think she's officially said, and we'll get to that, why that's important in a moment. But she's basically saying that even assuming that she committed some sort of fraud or there's an error, it was unrelated to her job at the Federal Reserve System. And the statute that says that the president can only remove her for cause means that she has to have done something wrong, engaged in misconduct as part of her job at the Federal Reserve System, as opposed to these allegations that in 2021, she engaged in mortgage-related fraud dealing with her homes. That her argument is that has nothing to do with anything associated with her job. Now, President Trump's position is essentially that, as I interpret what his position is that if you're willing to lie to banks to get a good deal when you are a Federal Reserve official, and your job as a Federal Reserve official is literally to oversee, among other things, mortgage interest rates or interest rates in the United States that impact mortgages, how on earth can we trust your judgment to do the right thing if you're willing to lie to get a good deal on the mortgages and get lower interest rates when you're literally responsible for voting on interest rates in America as part of the Federal Reserve System? So with all this said, what is really going on here is very scary for anyone that likes the Federal Reserve System, because essentially the federal courts are going to have to determine who decides what the term for cause means in the relevant statute. Is it the courts or is it President Trump? But the statute specifically says that Lisa Cook, as a Federal Reserve governor, can be removed for cause by the president. It specifically references the president, which seems to be strong evidence that the president gets to make this decision. Now, here's the thing. If it turns out that the courts agree that President Donald Trump or any president has the legal authority under the Constitution to remove members of the Federal Reserve System, it all of a sudden is going to take the Federal Reserve System from like an independent body of bankers, if you will, that are unaccountable to any of the elected officials. It's now going to make the Federal Reserve System accountable directly to the President of the United States as essentially an Article I executive branch agency analogous to the Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, the DOJ, the ATF, any one of those alphabet agencies, all of which are overseen by the President of the United States. So the president has argued that he has great discretion to determine what is for cause, and the statute references him, so he gets to decide. Courts are not allowed to interfere with this. And by the way, recently, if you look at what the Supreme Court has been saying during this more recent Trump administration, starting in January 2025, the Supreme Court has repeatedly sided with the Trump administration's legal positions about his ability to fire people that work for the federal government. Because as you know, the way the system is supposed to work is that Congress creates laws, Congress creates administrative agencies, and that the President of the United States gets to oversee these. But the president gets to fire people that work for these agencies because they're technically working for an administrative agency within the executive branch. So that means, for example, if somebody at the FDA, someone at the EPA does something stupid, that's going to come back politically and have blowback on the President of the United States, because the President of the United States is responsible for overseeing those administrative agencies, those executive branch agencies. But if the Federal Reserve System does something dumb, who is to be blamed, right? Jerome Powell, who heads the Federal Reserve System, you can't fire him as a member of the public. You can't make him unelected. He's not an elected official. So if it turns out that the courts really rule that the Federal Reserve System is like the EPA and under the executive branch, under the President Trump, well, he's going to be able to fire a whole bunch of people at the Federal Reserve System and bring people in that are more appropriate than these sort of independent, unelected bureaucrats. Keep in mind that the Federal Reserve System has, ready for this, folks, you're not going to believe this number. The Federal Reserve System has 23,000 employees. You heard me right, not a typo. 23,000 employees work for the Federal Reserve System. Seems like everyone with a PhD that cannot get a job with making real money on Wall Street, if you get a PhD in economics, goes to work for the Federal Reserve System. It's like a welfare program, apparently, for PhDs in economics, as best I can tell, because who else needs 23,000 of these people to do anything? Crazy, crazy. Nevertheless, that is the world in which we now live. So let's talk briefly about Lisa Cook's legal strategy and how this could backfire on the Fed. She is litigating this case. Now, remember, she has been alleged to have engaged in mortgage fraud. Now, what's going to eventually happen if this case goes forward, I suspect, is that if I was representing the Trump administration as a lawyer for the Department of Justice and advising Pam Bondi on this, I would say, look, the first thing I want to know, Judge, is Lisa Cook guilty or not? I want to call her to the stand. Lisa Cook, keep in mind, has been fired by Donald Trump. She is trying to keep her job. Lisa Cook brought the lawsuit. She is the affirmative person. She's not the criminal defendant. She's not the defendant. She sued. She seeks relief from the federal court. The first thing I would ask if I was the Department of Justice, say, fine, let's call Lisa Cook to the stand and testify. And I'm going to ask her a series of questions about, did she do it? Are you a crook or not? Did you lie or not? Here's the thing. She is going to be placed in a huge dilemma with her lawyers because there is an ongoing criminal investigation. And if you give good advice to people as a general matter, and there's a criminal investigation ongoing, you tell them to shut up. Don't talk. Don't say anything. You take the Fifth Amendment. You plead the Fifth and say nothing. But here, Lisa Cook is not really going to be able to do that because she's the one that went to court. She sued. She's asking for relief from the court. She did it to herself. So I would ask her, if I was the Trump administration, to take the stand as a witness in this preliminary injunction hearing and to explain herself and to explain whether or not she committed these crimes. And I would cross-examine her with all the relevant documents. And she's going to be faced with a choice. She can either testify about all these things, and did she do it? Did she not do it? Which will only help the criminal lawyers at the Department of Justice assess whether or not they have a case. So she could testify, which would really be against all advice. In most instances, you would not want your client testifying in a civil case, and something could implicate a criminal matter because you don't want them to go to prison. So she may testify, which would be great for DOJ to get her answers, get her information under oath. Okay, lock her into testimony. Or she might plead the Fifth Amendment, say, I'm not testifying because I have to take the Fifth Amendment. But then you could do what's known as take an adverse inference against her, because every single question or an issue that comes up in a case that might be present, you can assume that her testimony, if it were actually given, would be adverse to her interest, would be against what she wants, against her interest. Now, that adverse inference is not available in a criminal case because you're not allowed to use somebody's silence against them in a criminal case, but that is not the same rule that applies in a civil case. And because Lisa Cook brought a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit against Donald Trump, you would be able to draw an adverse inference against any refusal to testify if you ask her, did she commit the fraud and lie on her applications for mortgages back in 2022. So this entire lawsuit involving Lisa Cook is extremely dangerous to the Federal Reserve System. If she prevails in the D.C. trial court, which is likely because that's a terrible trial court, they hate Trump in that court, we know that, they're going to seek an appeal. And if they do so, these appellate courts, including the Supreme Court, are finally going to have to decide what is the relationship legally between the President of the United States and the Congress and the Federal Reserve System, because they're going to have to decide that, because they're going to have to figure out who has the authority to define what is for cause and who has the authority to determine if for cause exists before someone can be fired by the president. These are major questions. And in order to answer these questions, certain fundamental premises have to be addressed first. And the first one is, what exactly is the Federal Reserve System? Is it part of the Article 2 executive branch where the president has full authority over it? Or is it something else? And if it's something else, we know that Chief Justice John Roberts does not believe in anything other than the three branches of government. He's very, very particular about separation of powers and the powers of the various three branches. And I can tell you the Federal Reserve is not going to fare well in a court involving Chief Justice John Roberts. Again, all of this stuff is going to have to come into play to determine whether or not President Trump, as the head of the executive branch, can remove Lisa Cook as a Federal Reserve governor from some entity that might be part of the executive branch or might be a fourth branch of government, which Chief Justice John Roberts is going to say cannot exist in our constitutional form of government. So this is a very big roll of the dice for Lisa Cook, but maybe she doesn't care. But if I were Jerome Powell or any lover of the Fed, I'd be extremely nervous about the case here. All right, folks, so there you have it. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at 4Boxes Diner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the 4Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.